So in this video we're going to have a look at creating an A-line skirt. So that's a skirt that starts at the hips and then extends a little bit out. So there's a little bit of flare in it. It's not very full and it's not straight and it's definitely not tapered. So an A-line skirt. I'm going to start by using the block, and we're going to create the fullness, that little bit of fullness, by eliminating and closing the dart at the top of the block. So this technique that I'm going to show you first is called slash and spread, and you'll see why. So we're physically tracing and cutting out the paper and manipulating it in order to get the shape that we want. So I'm going to start by placing this fold edge right on the edge of my paper. That's one little extra bit of drawing and cutting that I don't need to do if I do that. Placing the weight on, and then I'm going to trace all the way around, including the notches and the darts. So you can see I'm holding onto the side of my pattern as I'm going so that it's held down and it's not moving around. Okay, I've got the notches for the dart. I also need to make sure I have the end of the dart, and that's gone through. Okay, drawing on the dart. Now we need to extend this line all the way down to the hem. So taking this measurement up here, which is 10.5, and then I can mark a couple of points down here, 10.5 and 10.5. Now we're going to do the same thing for the back of the skirt. So placing the weight on so that it doesn't move around. Trace all the way around. Before I lift it up, I'm going to also transfer the grain line. And I've forgotten the drill hole for the dart, so place the block back on and then transfer that. And we're going to do the same thing by rolling in the dart and extending a line all the way down from the end of the dart to the hem. So because of this curve here on the pattern, I can't measure from there to there and then translate that down to the hem. So what I need to do is to draw in the grain line. And use this as a reference. So I'm measuring from the end of the dart to the grain line, which is 8 centimeters, and then I transfer that down and part way down. Once you've drawn your cut lines, you can start cutting out. So, cutting down that first arm of the dart and then all the way down. Now I can cut out that second arm of the dart, and this goes in the rubbish bin. Now before I get too enthusiastic and cutting all of these pieces up, they're going to end up looking quite similar, so it will be helpful if I label them before I get confused. So this is my center front, this is my side seam from the front, side seam, back, and the center back. Okay, now to create our pattern pieces, what we'll do is, so we've opened this section down here and we're going to pivot them and close the dart at the top, and this will give us the shaping that we want on the hem. So we need to place them on top of a piece of paper so that we can complete the patterns. So starting with the front, I'll move the back over here. Okay, so I'm working on the half here and I want to create a full pattern, which means I've folded this paper in half. And I'm going to place the center front on the fold. Pop it down there. And you can see that over here in this corner, I'm missing some paper. So rather than going and cutting a whole nother piece, I'm just going to trim a little corner off for the front and for each side and then masking tape it on. So as I've said in other videos, masking tape is always your friend. A little bit down here. Alrighty, so now I'm going to tape down the paper across the top. We don't need to tape the whole thing down super strongly because we can remove it afterwards. It's just so that we can get the shape of the pattern and that it doesn't move around. Okay, now I'm closing this top dart here. Okay, now we have the shape here. We've got this opening and we need to use our French curve to smoothly connect those two sections of the hem. So we can't simply draw a straight line here because you would have a hem with points like that. So we want to smoothly connect it. So use the section of the French curve that you think works. So maybe that bit is a little bit too flat. So I move it around and give it a little bit more of a curved edge, and then draw that in across the bottom. Like that. Now you would be completing your pattern, the front, with the grain line, the labelling, adding your seam allowance and your hem allowance. Okay, so again we're going to do the same thing where we're closing the dart, making sure that the waistband lines up and is connected nicely, and then tape it down. Now that you've got this, we need to again create that smooth flowing hem shape. Across the bottom. Now your back pattern is ready to finish with your grain line, your seam allowance and your labelling. Before I do that, I'm going to demonstrate the second technique for adding flare to the skirt, which is the pivoting technique. So the first technique was slash and spread. Now this one is pivoting. What we're going to do is manipulate the block in exactly the same way, but rather than cutting out each of the sections and then sticking them back together, we're going to use the lines on our block to trace it and then pivot it closed. So that's why this technique is called pivoting, because you're turning the block from the end of the dart, you're pivoting it like that in order to create the shape that we want for the A-line skirt. So I'm placing it on a folded edge of paper so that I can create a full front pattern piece, placing it along the edge and weighing it down. Now I've got a line drawn already from the end of my block to here. I'm just going to extend that down to the hem of the block. Okay, so the first part that we're going to trace is this section here. So tracing from the hem to this point only, and then up from the centre front waist to the first arm of the dart. That's the first step. The second step is to hold this point here, so you can hold it using your finger. Some people might prefer to use a pen. And then we're going to close the arm of that dart and pivot it around here like this. So I've pivoted that dart shut. The second arm of the dart is sitting on top of the first one. And so placing the weight back on, I now finish tracing around the waist, the side, and this section of the hem. And take it off. To finish our skirt, we use the hem, the French curve, to create that nice curve on the bottom of the hem. Like that. And our front skirt is completed, apart from the hem, the seam allowance around the tie and the side and the top, and our grain line and labelling. I'll leave that till last. So the first pivoting for the front, as a little recap, we start by tracing this section at the centre front to the dart. Then we hold the end of the dart, close it, and trace this second section here. Okay, now we're going to repeat the same process, but with the back skirt, and then we will finish the seam allowances and the labelling. So I need to rule the line that goes from the end of the dart down to the hem, and I'm going to use my grain line. So that's 8 centimetres. So this is really the mark that I need on the end. I don't need to rule the whole line all the way up to the end of the dart. I just need to mark that position down there. So I'm starting with the centre back. I can see my centre back is marked there. So I'm going to place the weight on and trace around. So we're tracing from the first arm of the dart down the centre back. Don't forget your double notches. And you're just going to this point that you've marked on the hem. So step 1, tracing from the dart, the centre back, to the hem. Then holding the end of the dart, pivoting close to the dart like that. Placing the weight on and tracing the second half of our pattern piece. to this point that we've marked on the hem. Remove the block and then finish this with our French curve. So other times when we've traced a dart from a block to a pattern, we have the drill hole. In this case, what we've done is close the dart and we've eliminated it. So we don't need to keep the drill hole on either the front or the back, because essentially the dart is gone. It's not part of this design anymore. Now we've got our two shapes for the front and back. We're adding seam allowance. So I'm going to add 12 mils to the hem, 12 mils to the side seam, the centre back, and 12 mils to the waist. This notch here, we don't need anymore, so that one is not being transferred to the waist. Put 12 mils on the centre back seam. And then 12 mils, so this will be a double rolled hem. And we will transfer these notches. So this notch is being transferred to the centre back, this notch to the side seam, and extending the seam allowances into the stitching line into the seam allowances, sorry. Now I need my grain line on the centre back. I've forgotten to transfer that. So I take the back pattern, again, the block, and place it in line with the back, and now I can see where my grain line sits. Make sure your grain lines are nice and long, that you don't do little short ones when you've got the space, and this will help you when you're laying your patterns and cutting them out of fabric. The labelling, 6 pieces of information: name, garment, A-line skirt, front. With our front, the centre front is here, there's no seam, which means we know that this is cut 1 self. Size 10, and it is number 1 out of 2 pattern pieces. So there we have 2 techniques, slash and spread and pivot, to create the one pattern piece. So you'll see that this fits exactly over the shape that we created with the slash and spread. And at UTS, we are more than happy for students to use either technique. It depends completely how your brain works. Some people find one technique easier than the other, and we don't mind how you do it, as long as you make sure that you're following the steps and you're checking all your pattern pieces as you're altering them.